Now, I should say that yesterday we were sending emails back and forth because in the last 24 hours, there have been a series of major headlines that have come out. And I'm going to read a few, and that might sort of explain why the view from Washington is important. Politico reports Republicans might block Trump from killing the Iran nuclear deal. CNN headline, Tillerson's dramatic plan to save the Iran deal, keep up pressure. And a New York Times headline, Mattis contradicts Trump on the Iran deal ahead of crucial debate. This was all in the last 24 hours. So while we're here talking about Europe, a whole nother set of things is happening in Washington. And I think that's exactly sort of the issue that we'd like to unpack in this conversation. So to begin, I'd like to ask both Barbara and Jarrett, from their perspectives, to give a little bit of just briefly, a sort of state of play. Where do you think that we are right now as we approach this sort of looming decertification question? And then we'll go into some more detail about what the issues might be. Barbara?
Thank you very much, Yar. Thank you for inviting me back. It's a pleasure to be back at this forum. I'm operating under the assumption that Trump will not certify the Iran agreement again. But I believe that that does not necessarily mean that there will be new sanctions. There is another story which you didn't mention that came out on the Politico website this morning that said that Trump would ask Congress not to reimpose sanctions, but would come up with some new package of punitive measures, perhaps including designating the Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization, which is one of the perennial suggestions that's been around in Washington for many years. Trump has made plain his disdain for the agreement, given what he said, particularly at the UN, where he called the deal an embarrassment to the United States. I find it very difficult to believe that he will actually certify again. But of course, nothing is ever final with Trump. You know, he is a man who is subject to moods. And I will say that those of us who support the agreement have been working very, very hard over the last few months to stress its importance, its accomplishments. And we've also been stressing the European angle. At the Atlantic Council, we had a major event just a little more than a week ago. We had the ambassadors from France, Britain, and Germany, and the European Union ambassador in Washington make a very, very forceful case for continued American implementation of the agreement. So I think that's where we are now.
Jarrett, you're here this year in a little bit of a different capacity than last year. I don't know how you see things right now.
Well, Jarrett, let me first of all thank you for inviting me back in a personal capacity. I believe that what you're doing here is very important, and you're doing it very well, and I'm grateful for it. If I may, I'm going to put words in your mouth, having just complimented you, and say that I think that for almost everybody in the room, the real question, what you're looking to us to answer, is what's the United States going to do, and what does it mean for my business in Iran? And I can't answer either of those questions. The first I can't answer because it's in the hands of unpredictable political actors. And the second I can't answer because, quite frankly, I think it's going to be highly particular given the kinds of business that you're trying to do. What I can do, though, I think, is to make a couple of observations and suggest a couple of rules of thumb that you can use in examining what happens in Washington over the next couple of months and thinking about how it's going to affect the business climate in Iran in general and your business in Iran in particular. So the first observation that I'm going to make is that it has been a long time since somebody has lost votes in the United States for being hard on Iran. And so you cannot be surprised by negative rhetoric coming out of the White House, coming out of Congress, coming out of analysts in Washington whenever the topic of conversation turns to Iran. And the topic of conversation is very clearly turning into Iran right now. The second observation that I'd like to make is that politicians lie. Lots of people lie, but politicians lie. And so I think what you're going to find, if Barbara is right, and this question is referred to Congress, is that a lot of people who have suggested that they are desperate to tear up the deal are in fact not so desperate to tear up the deal. and that it might not only be President Trump who's looking to refer the question to Congress but not fundamentally change the terms of the deal, but it might be a lot of the Republican members of Congress who have suggested that they are looking to fundamentally change the terms of the deal, but in fact, when push comes to shove, are anxious about the possibility of doing so. And interestingly, these two lines of thought come together in an address that Senator Tom Cotton made to the Council on Foreign Relations yesterday, where there was a lot of bluster, there was a lot of anger about Iran, but what there was not was a suggestion that he, Senator Cotton, was looking to vote to tear up the deal if the question would be referred to him over the course of the next couple of months. So there are my two observations, and as I said, I promise from these two rules of thumb. So the first rule of thumb that I would offer to you is when you're watching what's happening in Washington, watch for what we do and not for what we say. Because the combination of these things, the appeal for sort of rhetorical hostility, but at the same time, the anxiety amongst the political leadership in Washington about actually moving away from the deal, for all of the reasons that we've already heard this morning, I think that's going to lead to quite possibly a lot of negative rhetoric without a lot of substantive change necessarily in the position of the United States. And so if you engage yourselves in a tremendous amount of sort of reading between the lines, reading the tea leaves, however you want to call it, I think you're going to cause yourself more anxiety than is absolutely necessary. Watch what we do, not what we say. Sorry, let me just say one last thing, and I apologize, I know I'm going on. John, this morning, I think you had stepped out of the room. John promised that I was going to, in my private capacity, be able to say things radically different from what I said last year. And I'm going to disappoint you, John, and say that I actually believed what I said last year, and I'm going to kind of repeat it in a slightly different political context and say that whereas I hope that the outcome of all this process in Washington is going to be the preservation of the deal, I know that the outcome of this process is not going to be a highly flexible U.S. administration looking to solve problems in the implementation of the deal. And so the problems that you face, the problems that we talked about yesterday in terms of finance, the problems that are going to be discussed as we get into today, you're going to have to try to find ways to solve them. So if European banks are having a hard time doing business, you're going to have to talk to European banks and European companies and European governments about solving that issue. And you're going to have to address the kinds of questions that you've heard posed about Iranian transparency here in order to resolve those issues. Because the best case outcome here is essentially no change from the United States, neither positive nor negative.
Barbara, I want to ask you to unpack a little bit of what was just mentioned. So this seems to be going, in a way, back to Congress, and it seems to be by design that it might be going back there if indeed Trump decides to decertify. What is it that you think ultimately, if, as Jarrett mentioned, and he might be correct, a lot of the politicians that had said that they were very much ready to tear up the deal don't want to, in fact, do that. What's weighing on them in that decision? What are they trying to avoid in the preservation of the deal? Is it mostly because they see the relationship diplomatically with Europe as important? Is it mostly because they feel that it would introduce conflict in the region? Or is it something far more specific to Beltway politics that they don't want to give Trump another opportunity to sort of write the script himself?
Well, I think, for Congress, we have to go back to 2015 when voting against the Iran nuclear deal was essentially a free vote because Obama supported it. And it was just a matter of assembling sufficient Democrats so that the Republicans could not ram through a statement of opposition to the agreement. The situation is completely different now. And of course, this provision of certification was put in to be a check by the Republican-led Congress on a Democratic administration. Now, we have an administration which is, far more opposed to Iran than anyone could have imagined, and it's really the White House that needs checking. So I agree with Jarrett. I think there's going to be tremendous reluctance. Transatlantic unity is very important. There have been a number of shocks now to the relationship. Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords, his questioning of NATO, his behavior in general has been very unsettling for our European allies. And we also have North Korea, as Helga Schmidt mentioned, which is a far more pressing crisis, and one that people in Congress are very well aware of. So I don't think we have the same appetite, and that's interesting that Tom Cotton, who has been one of the leading hawks, I mean, he wrote a letter to Ayatollah Khamenei saying, don't listen to Obama, listen to Congress, as I recall, back in 2015. The fact that he did not explicitly come out. There are others in the House. The chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Ed Royce, has said, keep the deal. Senator Corker, who is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, has decided not to run for re-election, which means he's entirely free to vote his conscience. He doesn't have to worry about party unity. And there are others, I think, Susan Collins of Maine, Jeff Flake of Arizona, Rand Paul of Kentucky, that have shown a reluctance to now come and overturn the deal. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's not even a given that it would go to Congress necessarily. This is an option. But if President Trump comes out and states that he is not certifying, but he doesn't want new sanctions, then why would Congress, which has so many other contentious issues on its plate, why would they then jump into the Iran nuclear deal? So, you know, it might not even go to the Congress at all. One other point, and I want to again underline what Jarrett said about Europe's role. I kind of look at Europe as sort of the California of the Iran nuclear deal. Europe is to the nuclear deal what California is to the Paris Climate Agreement. Trump walked away from Paris, but California, which is our largest state, is still abiding by all the restrictions in the Paris Agreement. I think it's even gone beyond them, which means that American car manufacturers have to keep to fuel efficiency standards set by California if they want to sell cars in the most populous state in the United States. Other states as well, Democratic majority states, are also abiding by the Paris Climate Agreement. So if Europe can stand firm, and it's not just your diplomats, your political leadership, but the businesses, if you don't run scared from the uncertainty that is going to be with us as long as Donald Trump is in the White House, let's face it, if you don't run scared, I think that will be a very important message in support of the JCPOA and also extremely reassuring, obviously, to your Iranian counterparts.
So I want to unpack that a little bit further because I think it goes back to what Jarrett just mentioned as well, which is this idea that the best case scenario is the deal is preserved, but we certainly don't have a US administration that's willing to do problem solving on a lot of the other issues, particularly issues that might be pertinent to US companies. So I think one of the question marks in the room is, let's say the overall approach of an office like OFAC at the US Treasury, how might that be impacted? And will we probably see more general licenses moving forward? I think the answer is it's relatively unlikely, especially or even if the deal ends up being preserved. However, that leads us to another issue, and it goes back to, I think, the sense that's come out of the forum this year, which is that whereas last year, and this was part of your message, Jarrett, last year, there was this understanding that, you know, principally it was the difficulties of the Iranian market that were perhaps creating hesitation or a delay in terms of trade and investment. This year, it seems to have reverted a little bit, and it might be a little bit more the rhetoric from Washington that's on people's minds. And so in the event that it's really not US action that's going to make the deal work, is there anything that you feel can be done from an advocacy standpoint, or is there a point at which we might expect the rhetoric to die down a little bit? Why is the Iran issue continually something that this administration turns back to? And is there any way to sort of divert that just to give a little bit of breathing room to the deal? Well,
I think actually, let me start by challenging the premise a little bit.
Sure.
That the wheel has really turned and that the issue is now largely the position of the United States. And the reason that I challenge that is because of the kinds of deals that have been announced over the course of the last 6 weeks or so and that have been discussed a lot at this conference. I mean, under almost any other circumstances, if the President of the United States had cast doubt on the long-term viability of US participation in the deal, you would not see Total announcing a $5 billion investment in Iran. You would not see a $500 million UK investment in the solar power industry in Iran. You would see people biding their time and waiting to see where the United States ends. Now, as somebody who has been and may even hope to be again a US official, it troubles me to see our influence in the world diminished in that way. But I think it's an analytical fact that it is diminished in that way. And so that's not to say that I know exactly what would happen in case the United States were to follow through on the rhetoric, but I think that the influence of the rhetoric has been dramatically less than what you might have predicted under other circumstances. Are there things that can be done to sort of change that further? Again, I think that really lies with the people in this room. And where I would not be looking to the United States to address, for example, the banking challenges. But there is no law of physics that says that New York has to be the center of banking relationships with Iran. And so I think to some extent, there is this is cold water reality that I tried to express last year and I'm not sure that everybody believed, which is at a certain point, if Europe wants to do business with Iran, you're going to have to do the hard job of finding ways outside of your normal transaction routes in order to facilitate that business. Barbara.
Yeah, I wanted to add also, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion, and I really valued it at this conference, about what Iran can do to make its economy more transparent, to address corruption and so on. But there are a couple of very important things that the Iranian government could do to improve the climate with the United States, to show that Iran is taking the high road, even if our own government seems to be taking the low road, to quote Michelle Obama. And that has to do with the detention of dual nationals. I mentioned this a year and a half ago, and the Namazis are still in prison. There are other dual nationals who are still in prison. Nazanin Radcliffe is still in prison and separated from her daughter and from her husband. There are, of course, many more Iranian political prisoners. And, these are things that the Iranian government does, and we hear from Javad Zarif that the judiciary is independent and so on. But these are really outrageous abuses of human rights, and they very, very much sour the atmosphere and give easy talking points to the critics of Iran in Washington, as if they needed any more talking points. So I will make my plea once again to the Iranian government to please free these people on humanitarian grounds and take away that issue from those who are opposed to a better relationship with Iran.
Which is, I suppose, probably the most salient answer to my question, which is that the ability to change the narrative in Washington, in a way, that responsibility falls with the actions on the Iranian side, and that needs to be respected and understood. We have a little bit of time left. I'd like to open it up to, I'll take probably 3 questions from the audience, if there are 3. There's one gentleman in the front here. Someone can bring a microphone. And then there's a gentleman in the back and a gentleman in the front here as well. Would you like to begin with the first question? We'll take all the questions and then have them answered, so please.
Sure. Morning. Thank you very much for the panel discussion. Sam Tamiz, Abaco Global Resources. The way I see it, there are 2 challenges that the US is facing. One is JCPOA related, and one is, quote unquote, Iran's malign behavior in the region.
Yeah.
And let's forget the latter one for now and focus on the JCPOA. There are certain provisions which face US opposition, sunset clauses, verification of Section T, and so on and so forth. However, the US delegation of the UN General Assembly, according to various reports and sources, they had to be schooled on the basics of the JCPOA. Now, today, if the US wants to address these certain provisions which it opposes in the JCPOA, is there actually a competent team to sit down and negotiate that?
Okay.
That's the first question. The gentleman in the back, can we get the second question, please? And then the third question is in the front here. third question is in the front here. If you can bring a microphone to Ambassador Terzi, please.
This question is for Mr. Blanc. I just wanted to, and this is Gordon Grant from G2 Metrics. I just wanted to clarify and make sure I heard you correctly when you said that politicians are liars and people should watch what they do, not what they say. And do you feel, or should we in the audience now understand that Supreme Leader is correct when he says that Americans cannot be trusted and the West cannot be trusted?
That's a very clever point. Ambassador Terzi, the final question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As a strong believer in the European Common Foreign Security Policy and an equally strong believer in North Atlantic cooperation, inter-Atlantic cooperation, I am quite concerned by this increasing divide between Washington and Brussels and European capitals on the GCPOA. But the divide is not only on GCPOA, it was well explained in the previous intervention, is especially on the overall policy towards Iran. And if we have listened carefully to the speech by President Trump at the United Nations just a few days ago, it is very clear that the most difficult problem for this administration is Iran. Is not only on nuclear proliferation, and beyond the JCPOA, nuclear proliferation is also the doubt that could be some agreement or understanding between North Korea and Iran, development of missiles, nuclear technology, and so on. But is on wider geopolitical issues, support to international terrorism. It is, we know that the State Department has on the blacklist Iran for terrorist activities. We know very well that, as was mentioned before, there have been proposals floating about blacklisting IRGC and so on. On all these issues, the Europeans think differently. So my question is how to reconcile the position and to make a more transparent cooperation between the Atlantic on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may just say, as an American, it occurred to me that the most difficult challenge President Trump has right now is probably the disaster in Puerto Rico. He should perhaps focus his attentions there. But let's begin. So maybe, Barbara, if you could comment on the last question from Ambassador Terzi about the scope of the issues. Iran policy is more than the Iran deal. And to what extent you feel that there needs to be coordination between the Europeans and Americans on that full scope.
Yeah, it's such a chronic issue in a way. It was somewhat bridged under the Obama administration, but the fact remains that American diplomats have not been in Iran for 40 years. And so the picture of Iran in the United States is very distorted and very stereotypic. People do not have any comprehension of the reality of Iran today. And when in my journalist career, I would always rail at the fact that whenever I would write a story, they would put a picture of, the mural with the bombs coming down and death to America and so on, and they would show pictures of women entirely in black, and this went on and on and on. It was never the contemporary Iran, the Iran that I saw. So I think there is always, Europe has to very patiently explain to the United States what Iran is really like today. There's no hope, frankly, for American diplomats to go back to Iran under the Trump administration. So it is up to Europe to say, no, this is what the people are like. It was so funny. It was almost ironic when Rex Tillerson made the comment after he met Zarif, these are very sophisticated and educated people. It's like he had no clue, had he never met Iranians before. So there's an educative process that has to go on. And I think it's very important, Mr. Ambassador, that on issues of genuine concern, that Europe and America remain together. We have been most effective in changing Iranian attitudes and policy when Europe and the U.S. have been together. If the U.S. tries to reimpose sanctions and Europe balks, this is not going to work. This is just going to drive a huge wedge, allow Iran to drive another huge wedge between the United States and Europe. So the coordination really has to be close. And I do hope that the Trump administration understands this and respects this.
And Jarrett, on the I'm not going to ask you to comment on the reliability of the Supreme Leader in terms of his political statements, but I thought that maybe it would be good, given that your former colleagues from state, for the most part, are still in place working on Iran, but there is a doubt as to whether at the higher levels in the cabinet, among cabinet officials, there's a full awareness of the mechanisms and maybe the ramifications of some of what's being discussed. How much confidence do you have that that learning curve is being addressed?
I really wish you had reversed these questions between us, I have to say. Look, American political transitions between presidents, even of the same party, are very complicated things. And I think that they are strikingly different from what most Europeans are accustomed to because of the extent of the political appointment system in the United States. So in Europe, the vast majority of people are career civil servants who stay in place and advise the new elected leadership. In the United States, there's a much larger turnover in positions, and that does mean that there's often, as you describe it, a learning curve as the new team comes up to speed. I'll reserve judgment on how well this team will come up to speed and just underscore the point that you made, which is that there are exceptional career civil servants in the United States government, and when the new team gets around to listening to them, it will be very well served. I actually will, I apologize for...
Please, go for it.
Let me just quickly say one thing also, Ambassador Terzi, to you, which is that I think that I know this about the challenges the United States and Europe face with Iran. Not a single one of them becomes easier if Iran is no longer constrained by the restrictions of the JCPOA, and not a single one of them becomes easier if the United States and Europe are divided. And what that means to me in the bottom line is that the United States needs to be able to take yes for an answer in continuing the application of the JCPOA. And finally, I welcome John's opportunity to speak fully, and as I said, and I will say it again, politicians lie, a lot of people lie. That is not a national statement, and as a little bit of insight that I can offer to you, to many of you here, to conversations that take place in governments all the time, it is often incumbent upon us as analysts of other countries to divide their rhetoric from their actions, and believe me, that is something that is often necessary in assessing Iran. And I believe that the United States, as exceptional as we are, is not exceptional in that regard.
Thank you.